You're watching The Cinefile. In today's episode, Ben and Jake discuss The Mandalorian, westerns, and how the two fit together. Without further ado, here's episode 1 of The Cinefile.
We are doing the very first podcast.
We've been talking about this podcast since literally my freshman year, and here we are 3.5 years later.
And the only reason we're doing this because I needed help turning on the freaking
I
computer.
know. And actually, I remember when we talked about doing this podcast, it was always going to be about movies. I feel like we're not going to talk about movies. We're going to talk about your favorite subject, relationships, aren't we?
No, I wanted to talk about...
you want to talk about movies? All right, let's talk about movies. Hell, I don't know what you're doing. We'll talk about movies.
Okay, let's talk about movies. Why don't we talk about Mandalorian?
Okay, talk about Mando.
Okay. So we've seen the first 3 episodes of the newest season. What are your thoughts so far?
I like it. I think it's been good. I would say I've been the most pleased with the 3rd episode of this season, the most recent one. And we've talked about this before, but at the conclusion of last season, okay, well, let me backtrack here for a second. I think what drew a lot of people to Mandalorian, because Mandalorian was very popular
Right.
in Disney Plus. I think it's one of the biggest draws that got people to buy Disney Plus in the first place.
Yeah.
I think its biggest appeal is that it can please Star Wars and non-Star Wars fans at the same time. You have the basis of Star Wars in that it's set in, this universe. So you have Star Wars fans that already buy in, and you understand, we've heard about Mandalorians before. We see Boba Fett, Jango Fett. They wear the Mandalorian armor, and then we get in the Clone Wars series. We go to Mandalore. So we know somewhat about Mandalore, but it's a thing that's not really been fleshed out fully.
Right.
So you draw the Star Wars crowd in with that, but also it exists in the Star Wars universe, but for the most part, the first season does not involve a lot of like Star Wars theory or lore, the kind of the mythology of Star Wars. Like, we don't really talk about the Force. We don't really talk about, we don't go into great detail about the Empire, the Old Republic. We don't go into great depth about it. Someone that, you can assume that most people have some passing knowledge of Star Wars because it's such a big phenomenon, especially the original trilogy. So even just the appearance of a stormtrooper or the word Empire is enough to trigger something in pretty much everyone's mind. But people like you and I, who can talk about for days, like the intricacies of the Empire and its faults,
right?
That's not what we're talking about in Mandalorian. You know what I mean? It's just kind of there. And so I think that's what drew a lot of people in. But the very last episode, what is the last, literally the last shot of the first season?
It's the Darksaber.
It's the Darksaber.
Right.
You just opened Pandora's box of lore right here. I mean, if you don't know what Star Wars is, like if you're not a big Star Wars fan, like that has seen the Clone Wars or like Solo, you're like, what the heck? This guy's got a black lightsaber.
Right.
What's this about? But you and I get really excited when we see that because we know, holy crap, we're tying into more Star Wars lore here. So to me, me as a filmmaker myself and a storyteller, I look at that, and also as a fan, I say, you just promised us a lot of lore. You essentially, Dave Filoni ending on that last shot of the Darksaber.
Yeah.
He basically said, we're going to delve into lore next season. To me, that's when I see it. And finally, in episode 3, we're starting to get more of that lore. We have Bo-Katan appear, references to Ahsoka Tano. Even you have Moff Gideon come back for a little bit in a hologram. And that's not to say the first 2 episodes of the season weren't good. I honestly, I really liked the first episode.
I did too. Yeah.
I'm a big Western fan. And I think, the whole series has kind of had a Western motif of it, but I think the first episode of this second season has been the most Western. It's been the most Western episode we've had this whole time. And so like, I really appreciated that. And plus I think I loved the score in the first episode. As a music nut.
Because that's Ludwig Göransson who did Black Panther. But I think what's really interesting going off of that idea of Westerns is, I mean, you look at Mandalorian, even look at something like Logan, which has come in that came out in 2017. And in the past 5 years, I think we're seeing more of a resurgence of not specifically westerns, right? Cowboy, saddle, kind of films, but what we are seeing a resurgence of is the concept of the lone gunfighter taking on either an apprentice or trying to help a younger person get back to where they're from.
Right.
It's a lone gunfighter in space.
If you're absolutely right. We are seeing this rebirth, and I guess I would. It's kind of it's not so much a rebirth of the Western, but I think it's kind of what you would call like the neo Western.
Yeah.
We're seeing
Mhm.
because you're right. It's not the black and white John Wayne, Gary Cooper, Roy Rogers kind of cowboys that my grandfather introduced to me as I was a child, and what I fell in love with about old westerns and old Hollywood.
Mhm.
But it's not that, and it's also not kind of the revisionist Western period that I would call of like the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, where you have, the introduction of spaghetti Westerns, especially Sergio Leone.
Yep.
Sergio Leone and Clint Eastwood, their brand of Western it's markedly different than the traditional Western. It's grittier. It's more violent. It's more ambiguous. It's darker.
Right.
And you see that pivot in the Western because it's not even just spaghetti Westerns or like Sergio Leone as a filmmaker. You have things like the Wild Bunch. I'm drawing a blank here. What's another violent? Well, I mean, Unforgiven. That's another Clint
Unforgiven.
Eastwood.
That's a great one.
It's
Yeah.
a wonderful, wonderful
Award-winning.
film.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I mean that's is Eastwood again, but it's a grittier Western, and so you see that kind of move. And then really, I think you know after Unforgiven, the Western kind of dies for a little bit.
I
I
agree.
think.
Because that
You-
was 1993. Okay.
Well,
It was 92.
93 Oscars.
Yeah,
Right.
93 Oscars. Yeah.
You're right there. But after that, which is interesting, is like it's not the usual progression of film where we have like like it's not the like rolling hills where you kind of rise and then fall. There's no that normal kind of progression because it seemed to with revisionist westerns, I would say um Unforgiven is kind of the it is the pinnacle and is also the cap, the end cap
Right.
of
Yeah.
the revisionist Western because after it is a sharp decline. There are really, if there are Westerns, they're not very good. I mean, I guess I'm trying to think here.
Well, I mean,
You have you have who is it? It's uh, Van Peebles' son. I get him confused. Is it Melvin? Melvin Van Peebles? Or is he the older one?
I think he might be the older one.
Okay. His son does Posse in 1995,
Mhm.
which is a Western and it's decent. I mean, the only reason I know about that, I did it for a project last year, and it's a good film. I would say it's a decent film.
Right.
It didn't do well at the box office. It didn't get any critical acclaim. It did very poorly with the critics. I think they were a little too harsh with it. But there's no notable westerns from like the 90s and the 2000s. But like you've been talking about, we're seeing this kind of this comeback of some Western ideals and motifs here, and things that present themselves as westerns, but in a new and fresh way.
Well, and I think what's interesting is right, especially in the last 20 years, cinema, especially the exhibition market, has very much been something. It's a cinema of spectacle,
Mhm.
right? It no longer were the days just because of the amount of content that Hollywood is producing, where you could go and just watch what even AMC would call like studio films, right? Or their what do they call that? Because it's AMC signature
Mhm.
films, which are more low budget. But really, the exhibition market has just become a spectacle kind of thing. You got Avengers, you've got Star Wars, you got stuff like that. And what's interesting is that of all of the different genres, right? Which genre has become more of a loose term, and there's a reason why that is so. But with especially like noir and Western films, those are taking place in our everyday world.
Mm-hmm.
And something like an Avatar,
Mm-hmm.
right, which is basically Dancing with Wolves in space,
Mm-hmm.
that becomes more of a spectacle. But I think the reason why we've seen a sharp decline is because it's outside our back door. It's
Mm-hmm.
something that we can go and see. But if you look at The Mandalorian, getting back to The Mandalorian, it's a Western in space. And they do such a great job of, even though a couple of the episodes had taken place on Tatooine or Navarro or more of these planets or landscapes that look more Western, but they have the foreign elements of the Mandalorian himself or different alien species. Um, the Crate Dragon, right, in the first episode
Right.
of the second season. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot more of of Western motifs and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to see that more as more of an afterthought, if you will, or something that it complements the overall story. But I think that's encouraging in our world today, because if you look at Disney Plus, you look at Netflix, you look at Amazon Prime, HBO Max. I mean, we could go down the line. But if you look at all of these different streaming services, they're just putting out a lot of content.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take all that content and if we start putting in and melding different genres, right, like a space western, it's more likely that we will be able to get more films that are um, that are more higher budget, more spectacle films, but with the sensibilities of a classic western. I think that is the evolution, and that's where we're going as um, as Hollywood continues to evolve. I think we're going to not. I think, and I mentioned this before. I think genre it has become something that is being thrown by the wayside, and the mixture of genres, space western especially, is something that we're seeing a lot more of, and that is definitely prevalent in The Mandalorian.
Well, you touched on something important, and um, you said that with the Mandalorian, like you have these motifs and aspects of westerns, but
Mhm.
you basically talked about them kind of becoming more support than the main story itself, and I think that to me that is the proper function of a genre. Genre is you said it's become kind of loose, and we have the melding of genres and everything, but really the genre should support the story and advance the story and help the story. The genre should never be the story.
That's a good
And
word.
I
Yeah.
think that's where I honestly I think that's why you see a melding of genres, um, especially around the 70s and moving onward is when you start to see this kind of dabble in like, you know, different genres kind of melding together.
Right.
Um, to create kind of their own kind of uh, you could even say subgenre of like mixed
Hmm.
genres. But I think that came about because the um the old genre system where it felt like people were making content to fit in a genre and their sole driving force of the story was the genre itself. It feels antiquated, it's flat.
Right. It's flat.
And I think that's why Sergio Leone and Clint Eastwood, like that moment was so perfect for them because the Western was becoming antiquated and flat. And they saw this as their moment to reinvigorate the genre and take it into something new. And I think that's what we're seeing again, right now. Because I mean, we're focusing on Mandalorian for this, but we have other things like um, Tarantino's The Hateful Eight.
Right.
You have things. You brought up Logan. These things that have Western influences,
The what
and
is it? The Ballad of Buster
the
Scruggs.
Ballad of Buster Scruggs. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you have these things that are Western in their elements, but are not traditional Westerns in their execution and in their stories,
Right.
which I think is good. And I think it is new and it's interesting and it's something that people want to see. Because I think it becomes I think there's been an emphasis to make the Western more relatable
Uh huh.
through this kind of neo-Western kind of movement we've been talking about. and it's this idea that, I have commonality with someone that's supposedly living, 120, 130 years ago.
Mhm.
And I think that's important, and that's what's going to connect with movie audiences and make it an important story. Um so I guess all that's to say that like this m- you know, I think it's good that they're kind of almost rewriting the western genre and kind of cherry picking its it's kind of, cherry picking their favorite elements. We talk about I'm taking a world film class right now with Dr. Gehring, and he talks about how um we talk about, all these early cinema things that like we see connections between these movies from pre-World War II and how we see connections to them in modern filmmakers.
Mhm.
And there's a few films that we keep talking about how it's like, one of them is Schindler's List, how Spielberg's pulling all these different kind of things and talking about cherry picking. And Dr. Gehring made the point. He's like, that's good filmmaking. The fact that, a director is taking choices that they've liked from different aspects and kind of melding them into their own vision, and the fact that putting those choices together, that's not to say that these choices aren't the director's own choice, but taking these things from, from different periods of a genre or even different genres in general and kind of mixing it together, like, bringing this back to Mandalorian, it's Dave Filoni taking, you know motifs and ideas he likes from the old westerns and then taking stuff from, the sci-fi world, to which, Star Wars itself is really kind of an old-fashioned like adventure movie set in space.
Right.
So even in Star Wars in and of itself was created as kind of a melding of a genre. And so, Filoni's pulling all these different things together in The Mandalorian to 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 make a very new and unique story that is not only exciting and is making money and is doing very well, but it's telling good stories.
And what I think is interesting about what you said, because there's this concept of pastiche. And what pastiche is it's taking different elements, right? Cherry picking just for the heck of it and not really elevating the story. But what's interesting also about what you talked about, George Lucas. So for listeners that don't know, basically, George Lucas went to studio executives and said, I want to make a Flash Gordon movie. And they said, no. And so he went and made Star Wars. Star Wars is an amalgamation of Flash Gordon, of Kurosawa's, right, Seven Samurai and different samurai films, uh, old adventure serials. It's an amalgamation of all of these, and it's not pastiche. It's elevating the story. So when we going back once again to Mandalorian, when we're talking about these different elements, um, pulling them together, you're absolutely right. That's one of the reasons why I think it works well, and it's going to be interesting. Getting back to what we were talking about lore at the
Mhm.
beginning.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Talking about this idea of pastiche, and I think, it's good to look back and see what other people have done and like taking what you like from that, um, but still making it your own and not like copying. You know what I mean? I think
Right.
that's the difference between, this kind of negative connotation of pastiche and then like, I guess what I would say was good pastiche or good cherry picking. I don't know if
Yeah.
there's really a term for it, but I just,
Homage.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe respecting what has
Hmm.
come before you,
Yes.
which I maybe this is just because I'm a classics nerd, but I think that's very important because I mean, give you a personal example. I've been working on a film. I've been directing a film. We're finishing up the edit right now, and there, when I sat down and shot listed this with my director of photography, there are a couple scenes that there was one scene in particular. I literally said, "I see the lighting as when Rick's alone at the bar at Casablanca."
Hmm.
That was the best way to describe it.
Right.
And, like, I don't mean this. Casablanca is one of my favorite films, and, like, the scene is very different than that scene in Casablanca. It's a different message. I mean, they're both ominous,
Right.
but it fits differently into each story, and the best way I knew like, I saw that I had seen that lighting in Casablanca. People talk about the lighting in Casablanca all the
Well,
time.
it's a noir film. I mean,
And
it's yeah.
it's a great example of lighting, a great example of lighting in black and white film. But that's all that's to say is like I liked that one thing and I wanted to take it and bring it into this film where also, I take, shocker, I have Western kind of elements or motifs in this film in that like I wanted an emphasis on wide shots
Right.
and like letting the scenery and the raw kind of beauty, but also kind of the rawness of nature to kind of almost be an element in the story itself.
Mhm.
So taking that kind of idea, and that, I guess all I say is not to say like, oh look at me, I'm a great filmmaker, I'm doing all this thing, but I don't want someone to hear this and say like we're not ragging on filmmakers that take things, take what they like and kind of cherry pick. We're trying to say, with Mandalorian, this is a good example of that, and this is how it's done right.
Right. And I think going from cherry picking to Dave Filoni, right? So Dave Filoni is one of the creators of The Mandalorian. He created Clone Wars. He's the closest thing that his generation is going to get to a George Lucas.
Mhm.
And what he's starting to do now is take elements of lore from Clone Wars and Rebels and are bringing that into The Mandalorian. And it's very interesting to see because, like you mentioned, the first season, it's Star Wars adjacent, right? It's not something that is directly related to the Skywalker saga. It takes its settings from the Star Wars universe, a little bit of the scenario in which or the time period that the Mandalorian is in, but other than that, it doesn't really talk about that. And now, with somebody like Ahsoka Tano, bringing her in, and that's being played by Rosario Dawson, and many people believe that she's going to get her own series, especially with a name like Rosario Dawson. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's not just a cameo, right? But taking this lore, it's going to be interesting to see how you fit that in to the space western that you're doing in such a way where it's not heavy-handed or something that turns people off, but eventually encourages them to go and watch Clone Wars or Rebels. And that's kind of the same thing with this pastiche argument or this homage argument is that one of the reasons for filmmakers like you or film cinephiles like me, if I were to make a film, I would want to harken back to some of my favorite moments in film, right? Because those define me. But I also want to acknowledge them so other people can go and watch. For instance, like Back to the Future, right?
Mhm.
One of the greatest movies ever made. If you don't agree with that, folks, I'm sorry, you're wrong. But Back to the
Stop
Future,
listening now if you
stop
disagree
listening.
with that. We don't. Ben does not want your
Yeah,
listenership.
yeah. No, one less view, one less listen is fine. But what's interesting about Back to the Future is the beginning of Back to the Future. It has a bunch of ticking clocks, and it is this pan across the ticking clocks. And that is something that if I were to ever make a film, I would want to acknowledge. I think that's a brilliant foreshadowing of the film. The fact that time is so important in the story. But I just think it's a cool shot. And I would want to do something like that or show that in my film and say, hey, this was the inspiration. I really hope you go and watch the original
Mhm.
because everything is a remix, right? Especially
Mhm.
when we're talking about creative endeavors, talking about films. The way you make films comes from your past, especially the westerns you love to watch. I mean, if you guys haven't been to Jake's house, he has so many movies, right? I'm huge into collecting, especially Blu-ray, 4K discs, and this man has the most DVDs I've ever seen, other than maybe Pastor Mike.
Maybe Pastor
Pastor,
Mike.
yeah,
Pastor Mike's got a lot of DVDs.
Pastor Mike Hewitt has so many DVDs, and that was so cool. I can't say I was jealous because that, he's a pastor. I can't be like, oh, jealousy, right? But it was so cool to see all of those DVDs. But Jake has such a great catalog and such a great knowledge of these older films that he can put them into his own filmmaking. And getting once again back to Mandalorian, the fact that Dave Filoni is the creator of this and creator of Clone Wars and Rebels, he's able to do that in such a way that I think won't turn off audiences as much as different pundits that I listen to are saying, "Oh, well, it might be too lore heavy." But the thing that makes Star Wars cool is the lore. That's
Well,
the thing.
Here's the thing. Look back. I think you make the comparison of Dave Filoni to you called him the George Lucas of his generation. And I think you're exactly right, because look at what Lucas did with the original trilogy in Star Wars. The first Star Wars movie is not very lore heavy.
No, it's not.
You're really you kind of have to take the Force at face value
Mhm.
and just be like, this is the rules of this universe. And like Lucas doesn't get bogged down in explaining all that, because he knows no one's gonna care. No one's gonna
Right.
no one's gonna want to take like just watching this one movie, 1977's A New Hope. No one's gonna want to sit there and just be like spoon fed the history of the Jedi.
Mhm.
I mean, Alec Guinness' performance is brilliant.
Yes.
Period,
Absolutely.
because Alec Guinness is
It's
brilliant.
Yeah.
One of my top 10 actors of all time.
Oh,
Here's the
course.
thing. He is so brilliant and so perfect for Obi-Wan, because he gives off this perfect air of like, there is so much that has come before this, but at the same time, Lucas is masterful in how he creates the story. Obi-Wan isn't our access point to the narrative. Who's our access point? It's Luke.
Right.
Luke is a wide-eyed farm kid that really doesn't know a lot about what's going on in the rest of the universe. Luke is us.
Right.
I mean, through filmmaking, we're the edit and stuff. We're a little more we're more omniscient than Luke, because we get to see things that Luke doesn't see, get to learn things Luke doesn't know
Mhm.
through the process of the story. But we begin really as Luke, and
Yeah.
I think that's a testament to George Lucas's writing. People rag on Lucas for his directing style, especially for the prequels and everything, and I would tend to agree that the prequels
Yeah.
are lackluster. I think Lucas, though, is one of the greatest screenwriters and one of the greatest just story creators
Of all time.
of all time.
Yeah.
And so, the fact that, he's able to kind of put this in the same shoes as Luke, and we're learning things as Luke is learning them, and have to take them as face value as Luke does.
Mhm.
I mean, at the climax, when Obi-Wan's communicating from the dead and says, "Let go,"
Yeah.
like, we're just kind of like, what the heck is this going on?
Right.
And Luke's the same thing. He's like, what's this? But he just has to go trust it.
Yeah.
And we have to trust it right along this. But all that's to say, A New Hope is not lore heavy.
Mhm.
You get a lot of lore in Empire, and you get quite a bit of lore in Return of the Jedi too.
Yeah.
And it's this, you look at it, it's the same model Filoni's going with. You don't get a lot of lore in Mandalorian 1, but you promise it, and you come back for season 2 and we're getting more lore.
Mhm.
He's replicating that model because it worked. It worked for Lucas, and I think it's working for the Mandalorian.
Yeah, and that's so important, because for listeners that don't know, George Lucas went through many, many stages of the development process of the original Star Wars film, and he had notes upon notes upon notes of different lore, and it was originally going to be called the Journal of the Wills, right? I think it was like episode 1, the Star Killer, and so he had all of the knowledge of the lore, and he knew that he didn't need to put everything in there. So it's almost like sometimes with different films, I would say the difference between like many other fantasy films, or like a Harry Potter, is that the screenwriter is developing the lore as he's writing the script, and so a lot of it gets thrown in there early on, because it's almost like he's writing and trying to remember, okay, these are the rules of the universe. But when you have somebody like a J.K. Rowling or like a George Lucas, who had a plan in their head, had a plan down on paper before they started the process, and then went in and did it, they were able to, and just like Dave Filoni, they were able to start off slow, get you introduced to the world, get you liking the characters, and then you start sprinkling in some lore. it's going to be interesting to see it the rest of the season. We know that Boba Fett is going to play a bigger part. He's even having his own spin-off show. Ahsoka Tano is probably going to have a spin-off show. Bo-Katan, I think they were kind of trying to backdoor maybe a spin-off with that episode. But regardless, it's going to be interesting to see if they continue with this lore heavy or maybe back off a little bit and kind of go back to maybe a season 1 model. But again, when people tell me that they don't want to watch Star Wars, of course, the nerd in me is like, what's wrong with you? But it truly is, like you said, Jake, it is a masterclass at understanding how to show the rules of a universe or show lore from a universe, and starting off slow and then jumping in quicker, because that's how you get people to go and see it. Now, my dad who passed away last year, he loved to tell a story about when he went and saw Empire Strikes Back. And for those of you who haven't seen Empire Strikes Back, I'm not going to spoil the movie. Now, I'm sure you know, but people in just society, it's permeated society so much that
That came out in 1981?
80.
80. We are sitting here in 2020. That's 40 years after. Y'all have had 40 years
Okay,
to figure out what the heck happened.
Okay.
I think the statute of limitations has worn off. Barry Umansky, you may be able to correct me on that. But...
Right. So, okay. Basically, we find out that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father. And the scene goes, no, I am your father. And Luke's like, that's not true. And then he just says, yeet, and jumps and falls down Cloud City. And my dad tells a story of when he went and saw it for the very first time. And he was standing in line, getting ready to get his tickets to see the film. Now, this was back in 1980 when blockbusters literally meant the block had been quote unquote busted, or that the line stretched past the block. That's what we saw with Jaws, which arguably is the first blockbuster. And that's what you saw with Empire Strikes Back. And Jake.
Sorry, I had to do my handheld shark impression. We should really make this a video podcast.
We should, yeah.
Then I can do all my hand motions.
Your hand motions.
Anyways, talk about your story.
Yes. And so the two people in front of him were talking about the film. They had already seen it. And Dad didn't see it opening day. He saw it within the week. And they had already seen it. And they were talking about, do you really think that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father? And my dad was like, what the hell? What
a bunch of jerks.
Yeah, what do you mean? What do you mean he's Luke Skywalker's father? And they go, "Oh, you haven't seen it yet." He goes, "I've seen it now." He still watched it. He still went and saw it multiple times in theaters.
They just ruined arguably the biggest cinematic reveal
in history. Yeah, and pardon my French, by the way, for me saying hell, but I mean, he was literally
a PG podcast.
But
you invited me on the show. It's got to be PG,
right? And he literally goes, "What the heck? What do you mean?" He still saw the movie, and he still saw it again and again. And the importance of Star Wars is the fact that the lore, the story, the pulling of elements from different genres before it endures. It's something that you will watch again and again and again and pull something new every single time. There was only one person in Indianapolis who had the rights to show Star Wars, because before Star Wars came out, everybody thought it was going to be a flop. George Lucas left the country, the continental United States. He left the continental United States when it premiered.
He went to
I think he went to Hawaii.
I think I know this story. He goes to Hawaii with Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, and Francis Ford Coppola, and they each brought a cut of their new movie. This might be a different story, because I don't think Lucas did leave the country when Star Wars premiered.
I think it was for a vacation.
Yeah. But I guess, sorry, I didn't mean to confuse the stories, but I think this is a fun story to tell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Star Wars stories. This story is from Lucas is finishing the cut of Star Wars. He's shot it all. He's got it mostly together, but he's still got some stock footage, his placeholders and stuff. And anyways, he goes out to Hawaii with Spielberg, De Palma, and Coppola. Arguably, like the Mount Rushmore
Yeah.
of 70s filmmaking right there.
Yeah, those are the OGs
I
right there
mean,
for sure.
those four men like defined filmmaking. They dominated filmmaking for at least 30 some years.
And Spielberg is still at it
Yeah,
today.
yeah. But they each the story goes they each brought a cut of their current film they were working on. I don't remember what everyone's film was, but Lucas's was Star Wars.
Right.
Everyone hated it except Spielberg. Even the Lucas hated it. He was which like if you've ever seen an interview with George Lucas, he's one of the biggest Debbie Downers I think to ever live. Like
Oh, absolutely.
he is always so self-critical, which I think, this kind of speaks to the artistic process because I think, both of us can be fairly
Critical, yeah.
self-critical of our work, which I think is a good thing as an artist. But Spielberg was the only one out of those four that said, "No, you've got something here," and supposedly, legend goes that Spielberg and Lucas made a kind of a trade-off,
Right.
where they promised each other a percentage of the gross,
Mhm.
or a percentage of like the rights or
Points. Yeah.
they were getting money. Basically, they said, "I'm going to sign over, X amount of my gross
To you.
for
Yeah.
this film," and they kind of did that for each other's film. Spielberg still gets checks to this day.
Yeah. Well, because Spielberg's film was Close Encounters.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is a great film in itself, but it's not the commercial success of Star Wars.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
he also didn't negotiate as good a deal as Lucas did for Star Wars.
well, and also, yeah, because Lucas maintained like licensing rights,
merchandising.
merchandising.
Which no one ever merchandised before Star Wars.
Yeah. And then Alec Guinness got, was it 1% of all gross? I think he got one, yeah.
I think he got two.
Or maybe
no, it was one.
it was one
because
something.
he
yeah.
does. There's a British talk show. I think it was Parkinson. I think there's an interview on YouTube.
Mhm.
It's the world of the internet. Go look it up for yourselves.
Right.
But it's an interview he does, and when he signed on, the story goes that like he had signed on for like 0.75% or whatever.
Yeah.
And then before they were getting ready to release the film, like they renegotiated and they tried the guy, the accountant or whatever, the lawyer, whoever's haggling with Guinness's people, said something about like I think they wanted to talk him down to like 0.5% or whatever.
Right.
And he bumped him up to 1%. Savage.
That is well, and so his estate is still getting checks today, right? And but the thing about Star Wars and its importance is not just because of nerd culture, it's not just because of pop culture. It's an understanding of the different things we've talked about with Mandalorian, and that's why Mandalorian, I think we both argue, is so successful, is because it's cherry picking different motifs and genre staples. It is something that isn't lore heavy in the beginning, but it kind of like dived toe in the water and then just jumps head in and you're all in at that point. And it's just a masterclass. And it just blows my mind, right? I say it all the time. If you know me at all, you have heard me say, speaking of relationships, when we talked about at the very beginning, one of the questions I ask girls is I'm always like, hey, have you seen Star Wars? And if they say no, I said, are you willing to watch Star Wars? Because if you're not willing to watch Star Wars, sorry, game over. Goodbye.
Go on and walk out that door right now.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure there are other reasons they want to do that too, but it's but it's especially if you're not willing to watch Star Wars and understand where I'm coming from, where Jake's coming from, where a lot of people are coming from, saying this is a masterclass, it's a brilliant, brilliant film. Then I'm sorry, I guess you just don't have the imagination that I'm looking for, or
I think just kind of a summation of what we've been saying this whole time is the success of Star Wars. Specifically we've been talking about Mandalorian, but the success of Star Wars as a whole is it at the end of the day, it's a good story.
Yeah,
and I think, and maybe I'm an optimist here, but I think the large part of why people go see movies is they want to experience a good story.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
what people want out of movies. That's what people want out of any entertainment they consume, you know. And we can sit here and like you and I can sit about here and talk about lore for days. Like if this was a podcast purely talking about lore,
Yeah,
we'd be here for the next 3 hours.
yeah,
I'd miss the football game I'm
yeah.
going
You
to
missed the
tonight.
yeah.
But here's the thing: it is that it's there for people who want it and are interested like that, like you and I.
Mm,
But at the end of the day, it's just a good story.
that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, my dad, um, he's only ever seen A New Hope. It's the only Star Wars movie he's ever seen. He went and saw it in theaters.
Wait. You're his son,
Uh huh.
and you've never gotten him to sit. Well, okay, I can kind of see that, but you've never gotten him to sit down and watch anything else other than A New Hope. Now he saw it in theaters.
He thought he's
That's
not.
cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. But that's the thing. My dad is a very, very much a realist. He likes things very realistic. I mean, um, he 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 prefers usually, documentaries over fiction films.
Right,
And
right.
the movies he does like, his I think one of his favorite films of all time. Maybe it's not his favorite film. It's up there though, and probably his top five is Remember the Titans, based on a true story. He likes that's just the kind of things he likes.
Right.
Um, but I asked him about Star Wars, and like to me, I'm like, oh my gosh, you only saw the first one, but like he was like, I didn't dislike the first one. He was like, it was interesting, it was fun. It's not something that like I wanted to keep going on this adventure. He was like, I had kind of had my
Interesting.
fill of it, and I was done. But he's like, it was a good story,
Yeah,
and
and
if you can get my dad, Mike Biller, retired football coach, to sit through a sci-fi movie. Like I feel
you've
like
done something,
I feel
right?
like I'm gonna have to like if I ever make a sci-fi movie, I feel like I'm gonna have to pay him to come watch it.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's all this is to say it's a good story, and I think any successful movie, any good movie, any movie that's worth talking about, at the end of the day, it's a good story, and that's what we value.
That's we've valued it for centuries,
Hmm.
right? Even people that don't necessarily believe in God or believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. We both believe in both those things, but even people like that, they acknowledge that it's a neat story.
Hmm.
Oral tradition, Homer, different stories that are being passed down from generations. It's always been a part of our society, and it's important to stay in our society and being able to create these stories. Um, just like Lucas or
Hmm.
Filoni is why I don't know, art is interesting.
Hmm.
It's why humans are interesting. They're cool. They're cool people.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, just to summarize what we've been talking about, um, a lot of people have attributed many things to the success of the Mandalorian. Anything from the stagecraft technology that they use, to Pedro Pascal, to Baby Yoda, to John Favreau. But at the end of the day, the thing that's most important, the thing that we would both agree is the driver for why Star Wars is so important, is it's a good story. And the reason why season 1 is successful, the reason why season 2 has been successful and will continue to be successful is because Star Wars, The Mandalorian, they're good stories. And that's the thing we value most in society for the most part when it comes to entertainment. And we will continue to do it.
Hmm.
And so this has just been a fun little conversation that Jake and I are having on Star Wars
A dream
Mandalorian.
3.5 years in the making.
You just watched the first episode of the Cinefile. If you liked the video, hit the like button. And if you want to see more content from us, hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the bell to get all notifications on upcoming content. For Jake Biller, I'm Ben Sparrow. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you back here next time.